Remember Bioshock? Of course you do. Even if you've never touched the series, you most likely have heard of how hugely influential it was. It won countless awards, received overwhelming praise, and broke new ground in the narrative-driven FPS genre. But the Bioshock you know is not what it was originally intended to be. Not by a long shot. At some point, the top-secret pitch document for Bioshock was leaked onto the internet. Taking a look at this reveals countless ideas and features that never made it into the final game, such as the nature of most games. Game pitches and early design documents are only vague outlines for where a game can be taken. Years upon years of work, playtesting, and iteration often change games drastically from their initial vision. Now, this is nothing to really be upset over, as it's just kinda how the industry works. Some things may get cut or rearranged in the process, but it's just to present the best game possible. However, that doesn't mean that we can't look back on these early designs and see a completely different game. Even if it'll never get made, why not indulge a little? Bioshock was originally set up to be much closer to a methodical, branching, immersive sim than the action-adventure FPS it became. Story-wise, almost none of the original concept made it into the final product. Horror played a much larger role, mutated sea life were common enemies, and the whole game took place underneath an island. There's so many little details in the pitch that could have led to huge differences down the line. So let's just dive in and see what could have been the Bioshock that never was. Starting with the overview, we can see that the pitch proposed player choice as the core aspect of the whole experience. When you hear a line like, "The only limit is their imagination," you probably picture a deeply mechanical game with countless interconnected systems. Thief, System Shock, Dishonored, and other immersive sims fit this description perfectly. While Bioshock did include some of these elements, it's not nearly as dynamic as the pitch proposed it to be. The other key points on this page are mostly straightforward. Visuals, physics, and story are things that could be said in just about any game pitch. The only other oddity is story-based deathmatch, a term which may have originated and died entirely within this document, but I'll get back to that later. We can also see numerous mentions of horror elements in lines like first-person action nightmare and scare the hell out of people. If you've played Bioshock, you know that a handful of horror elements, including a jump scare or two, did make it into the game. But it's quite clear that the game is still an action-oriented FPS first and foremost. Also of note is that the potential for a film deal was included in the pitch. They mentioned their previous game, The Lost, struck a deal with BBC Films before it was even released. Funnily enough, The Lost never actually was released. It ran into countless development troubles and was eventually sold off. But that could take an entire video to explain the huge debacle behind that game, so maybe some other time. Jumping into the story notes, we see a radically different idea than the final product. The player is said to be a deprogrammer, someone who kidnaps cultists and de-brainwashes them, whatever that means. The driving factor is the player being tasked with rescuing a wealthy heiress from a religious cult on an island. Typical damsel in distress trope, nothing unexpected there. Religious elements are heavily referenced throughout the document, even though we know religion isn't really a huge part of Bioshock. Bioshock's world is much more politically driven than religious. It wasn't until Bioshock Infinite that religious themes became center stage. Moving on, they take some time to explain the in-depth weapon customization system. Practically, it sounds similar to Fallout's weapon customization, mixing and matching different parts on top of a base weapon. Although some of the combinations they propose are much more complex than you'd find in Fallout. The magnetic grenades they mention here are one of my favorite proposed features from this document. The ability to pull in metal objects, enemies, and even redirect bullets. The potential for emergent gameplay and obscure bugs would be extremely high. It's obvious why this never made it into the game given the complexity, but it's still a cool idea. In the actual game, weapon customization is limited to a tiny amount of straightforward upgrades for each weapon. Things like increased damage or rate of fire. Nothing nearly as game-changing as what was originally proposed. The pitch also takes a couple pages to describe numerous interesting interactions with the world. Things like increasing the oxygen to make explosives stronger, or lowering the temperature to become invisible to thermal cameras. Lots of cool ideas in here, but the majority of them were scrapped during development. Hacking did make it into the final game, but not as broadly featured as was described. Another large feature was the ability to merge the player's DNA with that of aquatic creatures. This included abilities like electrical senses from eels, poisonous skin from jellyfish, and hardened shells from crustaceans. The notes mentioned that this process would sacrifice the player's humanity, presenting some interesting story and gameplay questions. As we move into the controls and interface section, we're greeted with the line, Bioshock is a first-person shooter plus, not an RPG with shooter elements. This section heavily references their previous game, System Shock 2, and discusses how to simplify many systems. This is a welcome change for some people and an unnecessary dumbing down for others. Everything here is pretty accurate to the final design, most notably the idea to remove inventory and character menus altogether. There's also a couple ugly design concepts for things like the upgrade terminal. Gotta love that hardcore Microsoft Word art. Moving on, the next section covers the enemies found throughout the game. These were divided into 4 main archetypes: cultists, genetically engineered beasts, cyborgs, and robots. We can assume that the default cultists eventually became the splicers in the full game. Robots made it in, although mostly just in turret form. Cyborgs got cut, but that's no big loss. Now, on the other hand, the genetically engineered monsters are one of the most interesting elements that ended up getting cut. Looking at a couple of the concept art sketches from this time, there's a handful of very cool designs using this idea, like this nasty two-headed fish barnacle man, or this crazy anemone zombie-looking guy. There's also this disgustingly cool lobster snail person statue from around that time. Overall, these concepts are pretty reminiscent of John Carpenter's The Thing, mashing different species together, blood, guts, and all. These designs lean into that original horror focus, and it really shows. Now, before we get to the final story notes, let's jump back to that mysterious story-based deathmatch that they mentioned earlier. The proposed idea was to allow certain monsters to be controlled by other players in an attempt to kill the main character. Gameplay-wise, this sounds sorta similar to Dark Souls Invasions, although the invaders would be exclusively controlling monsters. Even in the pitch notes, it mentions that this system will be a design challenge and definitely require some thinking. It's an interesting idea, but incredibly hard to pull off without frustrating the average player. As we know, no form of this made it into the game, or any future Bioshock for that matter. To wrap up the pitch, we get this rough story outline. The game begins with the player flying into the island intending to rescue the aforementioned wealthy heiress. The pilot is killed by the cultists, leaving the player stranded in a dense volcanic jungle. Eventually the player arrives at an impressive compound of massive structures built by the cultists themselves. The compound is devoid of life, instead being littered with corpses and audio logs hinting at what happened before the player arrived. Upon exploring the area, the player discovers a way into a large underground structure, branching off to each of the game's levels. Some of these proposed levels include a lagoon populated by hostile amphibious creatures and barbed tendrils, a path leading to the heart of a volcano filled with mutated seabirds, an area in which the player finds themselves no longer under the island, but beneath the sea itself, and a final descent into the cultist undersea dwelling with giant prehistoric fish looming beyond the glass. This concludes the bulk of the original Bioshock pitch. You can never look at a game pitch and expect the final product to be anything close to the original proposal, but it's still fun to examine the roots of classic games and see how different things shifted over time. What was your favorite idea from the pitch? Super customizable weapons, amphibious monsters, something else? Let me know in the comments. Like I said earlier, I really dig the idea of magnetic fields. Lots of cool emergent gameplay can come out of a relatively minor feature like that. Sort of like the recycler grenades in Prey. It's a little thing, but it means a lot. All in all, this pitch document was jam-packed with ideas that I just had to include in the video. So if you made it through this whole thing, thanks for sticking around. And if you enjoyed it, I'd be really grateful if you subscribed or just checked out some of my other videos. Enjoying this little slice of classic game history was pretty fun, so I'd be happy to do more of it in the future. Now, I think I'm supposed to say, would you kindly do something here, but I'll spare you the joke. Have a good one, folks.